right, welcome back everybody to another episode of the Atheniano Show, where each episode is a new ripple containing unknown but unlimited impact. Today I have a very special guest to help me talk about a very important election coming up in Germany, Eric Langenbacher. Dr. Eric Langenbacher is a senior fellow and director of the Society Culture Politics program at the American German Institute. He has a PhD from Georgetown University Government Department and remains affiliated with Georgetown. As a teaching professor and director of the honors program in the Department of Government since 2005, he has also been managing editor of German Politics and Society. He has published in German Politics and Society, German Politics, the International Journal of Politics and Ethics, in numerous edited volumes, and his works include Shifting Paradigms in Contemporary German Politics and Policy, and his textbook, Comparative Politics, Mapping Institutions, Power, and Legitimacy, will come out this year. So, Eric, thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So my job in these intros is to kind of hype up the subject a little bit, hype up like the importance of whatever we're talking about. But I think with this election, it's not. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not an underestimate to say that this is one of the most important elections in recent German history and maybe in Europe. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think I would say that it's certainly the most important election worldwide in 2024. I mean, there were a lot of elections last year. I'm sorry, in 2025, there were a lot of elections last year. And yeah, it's going to be significant given the importance of Germany in the European and the world economy, its sheer demographic size, its geostrategic location. I mean, who governs that country always matters. And you're correct. Now it matters just a little bit more.
And just to put it in perspective, we're talking about, right, the third largest economy in the world, the largest economy in Europe. As you said, this is a country that's going to have influence well beyond its borders. But for those not familiar with German politics and German government, just what exactly do we mean when we say there was an election happening in 4 days in Germany? Who are they electing, and what is the process for which they use to elect whoever they're electing?
Sure. So the elections are for what the Germans call the Bundestag, which is the more powerful lower chamber of the bicameral German parliament. And I mean, it's really where all the power is. The person who is the leader of the largest party, typically we become the Chancellor of Germany, which is akin to a prime minister in other kind of parliamentary systems. They have elections every 4 years. I mean, this is Germany after all. And if there's one thing to know about Germans is that they're very detail and rule oriented. So the actual rule is that they must have an election 46 to 48 months after the last election. So just about every 4 years. They also just changed the electoral laws in Germany. So it's a little different from what we've seen up till now. The next Bundestag will have 630 members. And obviously you need a majority of that to govern. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Germany, I'm talking about the Federal Republic, so West Germany after 1949, and then unified Germany after 1990, is that they've never had a government with an absolute majority. It's always been one coalition government or another, and that is going to be, in all likelihood, the case after this next election as well. So you have multiple parties that will come into an agreement and then govern, maybe for 4 years if they're lucky.
So that looks like multiple parties coming together to form a coalition to collectively get more than 50% of the seats in the Bundestag.
Right.
Well, where do things stand now with the polls and the way things are expected to go if the election were to happen today, according to the latest polls? I know not all polls are treated equally and not all polls say the same thing, but what other kind of overarching trends that the polls are lending to?
Yeah, what's interesting is that the proportions haven't changed a heck of a lot over the last few months, certainly since new elections were clear in November and especially in December. So leading the polls is the Christian Democratic Union / Christian Social Union, They're actually two parties, but they're in a perpetual alliance at the national level. The CDU competes in 15 out of 16 German states, and then Bavaria has the CSU. So it's kind of an interesting. So we often call those the union parties. So they're leading with 30%. Then we have this far right party, the AfD, which is at about 20%. Now they've gone up. They were up a little bit at certain points, maybe as high as 22, 23%. Then they were down a bit, maybe 18, 19%, but I think 20% is pretty likely for them. Then you have the governing Social Democratic Party, one of the oldest parties in the world, by the way, which is coming in around 16 or 17%. Then the Greens, who have also been in government up till now, at maybe 14%. And then it's interesting. So the other thing that's fascinating about the German electoral system is they have an electoral threshold, as we call it. So a party needs to get 5% of the national vote to be eligible to get any seats. So small parties need to hit that 5% threshold. And we currently have three small parties that are right around the 5% threshold. What's called the Free Democrats, which is a classical liberal party, the Left Party, which is a left-wing party, and a new party that's about a year old that's called the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, which is kind of a left-wing populist party. Sarah Wagenknecht is or was a big figure in the left party for many years. So they're all right around that threshold. And I wouldn't want to predict because, things are so close. But the FDP, which was also in that last government until they left back in November, they've consistently been under that threshold. So I would actually think they probably won't make it in. They'll get about 4%. This alliance side of Wagenknecht has weakened in recent months, but it's possible they might make it in, but they might get 4.5%. And then the Left Party, which was in the doldrums for a while, also evidenced by Sarah Wagenknecht leaving, has actually been surging in recent weeks and will, in all likelihood, make it in probably with about 6% of the vote.
So if the party doesn't reach that 5% threshold, they cannot form a coalition government. They are not eligible to be a coalition partner. That's
Well, because they wouldn't even be in the parliament, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
okay. Okay, understood. So based on the kind of four main parties that you just outlined, the CDU, CSU, a coalition, the SPD, and the Greens, where do they lie on the political spectrum, and what are their main policy platforms?
Sure. Well, the CDU CSU is certainly a center right party. The kind of traditional, kind of conservative party, which has ruled more often than not since 1949, with Helmut Kohl, Konrad Adenauer, and most recently Angela Merkel being the most famous chancellors. Merkel's party, and Merkel, of course, was in power until 2021, had become more centrist, so more center than center right. But the current leader, Friedrich Merz, has kind of taken it back to the right, especially when it comes to issues like immigration, where he really wants to limit the amount of migration that Germany has experienced, and maybe take on some even harsher policies than just limiting newcomers from entering the country. He wants to address the economy. The German economy has really not been doing well the last few years, with stagnant, even slightly negative growth. So, they want to get rid of regulation, reform the tax code, kind of like boost small businesses, deal with the energy issue. Germany has very high energy prices since Russian gas is no longer coming to them. So things like that. We have the Social Democrat. Oh, I should also add that Merz is a strong supporter of Ukraine, and wants to continue, maybe even increase the support that Germany has been giving that country. The Social Democrats are a center-left party, sometimes more centrist, sometimes more leftist, but certainly kind of center-left. The big theme that they've been kind of hammering is pensions, right? I'm here in Berlin right now, And you can see the campaign posters. Germans love their campaign posters, and they're often witty and kind of informative. And they're really pushing pensions, so increasing pension rates so that older Germans can live very comfortably. But also strong supporter of Ukraine. So when it comes to foreign policy, those two parties would probably be very much allied. And then also other reforms like increasing digitalization of German government, etc. Then we have the Greens. The Greens are also, by the way, strong supporters of Ukraine, and that's a topic for another podcast because they were a very pacifistic party once upon a time when they were founded back in the early 1980s. But now they are strong supporters of Ukraine. They want to continue the kind of the green carbon neutral transformation of the country. But I also get the impression that they're not highlighting that or pushing that as strongly as they have in the past, and then other kind of reforms as well. So those are the main kind of issues in their policies.
I understand that Germany's current government, that Olaf Scholz is a member of the SPD party, and Germany's current government is ruled by an SPD coalition. So given this, why are they so low in the polls right now, and why has their support decreased so much from one election cycle to the next?
That's a great question. So what's interesting, if you look back at the 2021 election, the SPD did surprisingly well. If you looked at where they were polling in January of 2021 versus what they got in the September election, which was 25-ish%, right? I mean, they increased by like 8, 9, maybe even 10%. So what's interesting is where they're polling now is where they had been polling for quite some time, with the exception of that 2021 election. But we're talking about 2025 here. There were obviously unique factors that allowed them to do so well. So, the way that I would look at it is, why aren't they polling even lower, right? They seem to have stabilized around their kind of like new normal, at least over the last 5, 10, 15 years, is how I would put it.
Um, and are there any polls or data out there available about what issues the voters actually care about the most? Because sometimes there's a disconnect between what the politicians are focusing on and what the voters care about the most. Do we know what the average German voter says is the most important issue for them in deciding to vote in the upcoming
Right.
election?
It's really interesting that you put it that way, because those of us who are students of public opinion, we often see some contradictions and complexities, certainly nuances in how people think about things and issues and stuff like that. And right now in Germany, there are kind of two sets of issues where there are contradictory opinions on the point of, or from voters. So anyway, by the way, there's great polling. This is coming from what's called the Politbarometer, that a group called Forschungsgruppe Wahlen publishes monthly and before the election weekly. So if you ask people what's the most important problem in February, they actually did 2 surveys so far. In earlier February, 40% said it was asylum, integration, migration, and 39% said it was the economic situation. Whereas 2 weeks later, all of a sudden 43% are saying it's the economic situation, 42% are saying asylum, migration, integration. This is followed by energy, right, and climate, which is, 15, 18%, costs, inflation. Then at about 7%, they're saying pensions, as well as education and schools. So it's kind of interesting. I should note that for a long time, it was all about the economic situation because of the poor performance over the last 3 to 4 years. But there were some horrific attacks in Magdeburg in Eastern Germany back in December, and then in January in Aschaffenburg, where like a small child was murdered by somebody. And that has brought, both of the perpetrators had a migration background, as the Germans would say. Now, even more recently, there was an attack in Munich that killed at least 2. So this has made this kind of issue complex much more important for German voters. But what's fascinating is they ask a different question about what are the most important issues for your own kind of electoral choice. And if you look there, um, asylum, refugees is the fourth most cited thing with only 26%. The most cited thing is actually freedom and security at 45%, followed by the economy at 44%, and then social justice at 39%. So it's interesting. Yes, freedom and security might have something to do with the other issue complex of migration, et cetera. But I think that people are probably thinking of the Ukraine situation and well, now the situation with the United States and things like that. So there's really interesting kind of nuances and complexities when you look at public opinion. And then the other thing that I would note is they also asked Germans, what do you think about the overall economy? And big majorities say it's bad or really bad, right? But then they ask people, how's your personal, financial, or economic situation? And then you have a big majority saying, oh, I'm doing just fine, or it's okay, if not good. So there's a kind of disjuncture between their assessments of the overall economy and their assessments of their personal, financial, or economic position.
What do you think accounts for that disconnect between people's opinions of Germany writ large and the issues concerning Germany writ large versus the issues that concern their own personal life and their own situation? Is it that media? Is that the way that certain parties have spun issues in Germany and hyped things up? Is it social media? Like what is driving that disconnect in
Yeah,
your
you know,
opinion?
but before I get into that, it's interesting because we see similar disconnects in other countries as well. First and foremost, the United States, but elsewhere as well. So it's not just Germans that have that kind of disconnect or whatever you want to call it. I think it's probably almost all media driven. Um, uh, I think the media have really, and all forms of media, have really been focusing on the economic situation and how bad it is overall for Germany. There are sometimes apocalyptic stories or articles that one sees about how the whole German economic model is passé and there's going to be massive change and unemployment and structural adjustment over the next few years. So I think that is probably what's driving this disjunction more than anything else, right? So the perception of the overall country you get through the media, but when it comes to your own economic situation, I mean, you can see your paychecks and you know how much things cost and things like that.
You mentioned that uh, a wave, not a wave, but recent, terrorist attacks by, uh, as you should say, what Germans call people with migrant backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds, has caused some of an increase in people's focus on the migration issue. There's a party, AfD, that is second in the polls right now and has really made a name for themselves by being very strong on migration and very anti-immigrants. I'm just wondering, two parts. One, how have they driven this issue and made it more of a focus in people's minds? And two, how have they capitalized on maybe small fears or small concerns that people have about increasing migration in Germany, and how have they amplified that issue?
Well, I mean, that's been their whole project. I mean, they were founded back in 2013 as a Eurosceptic party against bailouts for, struggling Eurozone countries and everything like that. And then they pivoted after the 2015, 2016 migration wave, predominantly from Syria, et cetera, to become this kind of anti-immigration party. So research shows that when people care about migration, when that's one of their top kind of concerns, that the kind of far right populist parties will benefit. So the fact that migration has been in the headlines, and I should add that I mean Germany's had multiple kind of migration waves. I mean, first there were Syrians and others, right? But more recently it's been Ukrainians. I think there's at least 1 million Ukrainians in Germany right now. I saw data. This is one of those things where different sources have different kind of estimates. There's also all sorts of categories of people with asylum or refugee status, et cetera. But there's probably over 3 million such folks in the country right now, which is, I think by any objective standard, certainly by subjective standards, kind of a lot. So migration is very salient. And when migration is salient, these kinds of parties are the ones that benefit from the whole thing. Of course, there's always push and pull factors, as we political scientists put it. So they're obviously doing everything they can to make people care about migration more and more and more. And the AfD is very adept, very savvy, especially with social media, TikTok, Facebook, everything like that. I think that most experts would agree that they vastly outclass the more conventional parties when it comes to their digital strategies, their social media strategies, et cetera. So yeah, there are reasons, maybe even objective reasons, why this is salient for Germans, but the AfD is also pushing this, with every effort that they make.
Well, diving more into the recent rise in popularity in AfD, I mean, what factors do you think, besides migration, explains why they've seen such a jump in popularity? Because they've been around. How long have AfD been around as a
12 years
party?
now.
12 years. And am I correct in saying that it's really this election that we've seen a dramatic uptick in support for them nationally?
So, a couple of things. So they competed in the 2013 elections and didn't make the 5% threshold. So they weren't in that parliament. Then they did really well in 2017 after that kind of migration wave, where I think they got like 12.6% of the vote. Then they did not as well in 2021. They were down at like 10 something, I think. And now they're up again. So, yes, you could say that compared to 2021, they will likely have double the support. But compared to 2017, it's only maybe a 6-point kind of increase, right? The other thing, too, is that their strength has been growing over the last few years. So it's not like they went from, overnight to 20% of the electorate. If you look back at Germany has 16 federal states, as I mentioned before, and they have off-cycle elections, right? So there were 3 elections in Eastern German states last fall. The year before that, it was Bavaria and the state of Hessen around Frankfurt in the West, right? So, and you can see, and then there were the European parliamentary elections last year as well. And you can see that over time, their kind of support was increasing. So, that's the first thing. So the second point that I would say about the AfD is we have to remember that there is a big East-West difference in their level of support. I mean, it's been a generation since German reunification, but you can, if you look at electoral maps and a variety of other maps, you can still see where the inner German border was for 40 years. These are still kind of different political systems. So the AfD is twice as popular in Eastern Germany than in Western Germany, right? In some of these Eastern state elections, they were getting 30, 32, 33% of the vote. In West German elections, they're getting, I think the best they did was maybe 12% of the vote, that kind of thing. So they're much more popular in Eastern Germany, and one needs to try to understand why that might be the case. So some people have argued that the AfD is also a classic outsider kind of challenger party, as we put it. So you might get protest voters. And Eastern Germans are especially discontented for all sorts of different reasons that go back to how German unification happened, as well as demographic change, which has been pretty brutal for a lot of Eastern German communities. Many people have left. The population has aged. They have nowhere near the migration that the bigger cities or the Western German states have had. So there's a lot of discontent, and for obvious reasons. So there's the protest aspect of the whole thing as well, which of course, again, push and pull factors. The AfD likes to kind of push, right? That there's this firewall, the Germans say Brandmauer, and none of the conventional or mainstream parties will work with them. And so that gives them empowerment as being this kind of anti-establishment, anti-elitist kind of force as well, which resonates not just with Eastern Germans, but with some Western German voters as well. I would be remiss if I didn't point out, particularly with men.
It's so interesting to me that you talked about the divide between East West. Is there any other factors like maybe economic industry or demographic makeup, but between East and West Germany that help explain why AfD has so much more support in the East rather than the West, or does it have to do with history? Um, what besides the protest role, if anything, the protest vote, do you think plays a role in AfD's uh, disproportionately large support in East Germany compared to West
Yeah,
Germany?
I mean, I think that really the biggest explanation is just the stagnant or depressed conditions that have characterized a lot of Eastern Germany since German unification. Not the entire region. Some of the cities like Leipzig, Dresden are doing, okay, if not, better than okay. But the smaller cities, the towns, the villages, the rural areas are really suffering for mainly because of the demographic issues that I mentioned before. What's interesting, and we see this in many other countries as well, there's hardly any kind of migration in these Eastern German places that I just mentioned, right? So, they have a problem with immigration in the abstract. It's not something that has affected their kind of daily lives. But, as with other things, university educated Germans are not voting for the AfD typically, right? It's people with more, I guess, average educational attainment that vote for the AfD. I should also note that it's not the least educated and the people who are, truly kind of suffering socioeconomically. They also don't typically tend to vote for, right wing populist parties like the AfD. They'll vote for probably the left party or this Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht.
Besides the East and West divide and socioeconomic divide, is there any trends or patterns we can see between, maybe age or gender with the support for AfD?
Yeah, well, I mean, but that also goes for support for other parties as well, right? So, in many Western countries, it's been women have tended center left or not or left for a couple of decades now, and that's also the case in Germany, although that is a much more recent kind of phenomenon and not as strongly perhaps as elsewhere, right? But certainly men are a major constituency of the AfD. I think two-thirds of their voters are male, if memory serves. Education is also a differentiating factor, and then as you noted, age. What's interesting is that the oldest Germans are the biggest supporters of the two kind of the Germans call them the elephants, the kind of dominant parties in the post-war period, the Social Democrats and the Union parties. So, I mean, I think people 65 and over tend to prefer parties like that. And for the last few electoral cycles, the youngest German voters, I can't remember if it's 18 to, I think 18 to 34 would be the demographic. In 2021, they voted heavily for the Greens, which is, a longer kind of pattern, and also for this classical liberal party, the FDP, which is not doing very well right now. So what's interesting is you'll see the highest levels of support for the AfD amongst middle-aged people. So that's kind of fascinating, I think.
Has the support, the increased support for AfD, and again, I know it's not dramatic, I know it's not all of a sudden, but that has gone from 10% to 20% and from 12% to 20%. Um, has that impacted the policy messaging or the policy positions of other parties in Germany, like the center right CDU CSU alliance?
Yeah, most certainly. So there was a very dramatic moment in German politics 2 weeks ago, two-ish weeks ago, where, I mean, it's a very strange situation right now, right? Because you have a caretaker government, still led by Olaf Scholz, but they don't have a majority in the parliament. So it's possible for other opposition parties to kind of get votes to the floor. So Merz was able to do that, like I said, about 2 weeks ago, which was a bill that would have, really clamped down on immigration and would have increased border controls and things like that. And the thing that was scandalous about the whole thing, at least to many people in the German establishment, is that the initial proposal was passed only with support from the AfD. And the agreement, sometimes informal, sometimes kind of formal, is that none of the quote unquote small d Democratic parties would ever rely on the AfD to get a motion onto the floor or to pass a motion. So it was really kind of scandalous for a lot of people. Then it came to a final vote 2 days later, and it failed, right? Mainly because of defections from the some members of the CDU, but also the FDP and some others. So it didn't pass in the end, but it shows that Merz at least is moving to the right on migration issues because of pressure from the AfD. But I should also add that even the last government, put some border controls in place and has tightened up and moved to the right, even though this was a center-left government, has moved to the right on migration. So I think that shows that the AfD is certainly exerting some agenda-setting power here.
And if polls remain the same, is it possible that the CDU CSU could actually form a coalition government without AfD? Is it possible to just like have the people vote for AfD, want to vote for AfD, but not actually have them enter into a coalition government? Because I'm looking at the numbers, and it seems like the CDU, CSU would either have to go, they'd have to join with SPD, and then it seems like either the Greens or AfD, which seems counter to their policy platform and their position being center right. But is that correct, or am I missing something because of the smaller parties that may hit the 5% threshold?
Yep. You're not missing anything at all. Right now, there's three mathematically possible majority coalitions, which would be the union parties with the SPD, what Germans call a grand coalition, the union parties with the Greens, or the union parties with the AfD. Those are the three possibilities based on prognoses right now. Everything's going to change, though, if these smaller parties and more than one of the smaller parties makes it into the parliament, right? If all three of them don't make it in, let's say they're all right below 5%, that means 15% of the vote will be wasted, along with those that have voted for others, right? And so the parties that do make it in will have a larger share of the seats compared to their share of the votes that they had, right? So yeah, it matters. So these small changes, and I mean, there's still a week left in the. Well, I'm sorry, not a week left. Okay, scratch that. There's still a couple of days left before the election, and so we'll see what happens. I mean, you have late deciding voters in Germany like anywhere else. So we really do need to look to see how those smaller parties fare. If one, two, all three of them actually make it in, then it will probably likely be another three-party coalition. One of the issues with Olaf Scholz's coalition is that it was the first ever three-party coalition, which meant there were just more tensions, more personalities, more ideological de-alignment. And so I think that most Germans would really not want to see another three-party coalition and want a more conventional, at least by German standards, two-party coalition. So we'll see. There's always going to be some uncertainty before the election results get in and tallied.
Has any of the parties indicated what they would do in a situation if they, like, has the CDU, CSU said they're not going to work? They wouldn't form a government with AfD, or have they entertained that possibility?
So after that dramatic vote in the German Bundestag a couple of weeks ago, Merz has reiterated repeatedly that he will not ever go into a coalition with the AfD. So I think that I would believe him on that one.
And so the election is Sunday. When can we expect to actually see what the government will look like, what the coalitions will look like? Is this a process that's going to happen immediately, or are we going to have to wait a bit to see how the parties negotiate with one another?
Yes, we're going to have to wait a bit. It always takes a while for a coalition agreement to be negotiated. We'll have a good idea on election night, even though it won't be the final result, but it will be close to final. We'll know how well the parties did. We'll know what the possible coalitions are. And if we're lucky, Merz might even announce who he wants to go into discussions with first about forming a government. Or certainly he would make an announcement within 1 or 2 days of that first those first results. Then um, uh, oh my gosh, the last time around, they had like pre-negotiations between the three parties, right? Mainly at the kind of leadership level. Then they had actual negotiations with like dozens of people involved in all sorts of different policy areas. Then they had to have the three different parties endorse the final agreement, right? So the election was in September, and the new government wasn't installed until mid-December or early December. So it'll take a while to get to that point, but at least pretty quickly we'll have an idea of who Merz wants to actually negotiate with. Now, this could take even longer, right? Back in, I guess it was 2017, Merkel was trying to go into it was called a Jamaica coalition. The Germans have all these fun names for all the different kind of party constellations, and every party has a color as well, right? So the CDU, the Union parties are always black. The FDP is yellow. The SPD is red, and the Greens are, of course, green. So the Jamaica flag has black, yellow, and green in it. So that was what they were negotiating. But it was actually the FDP, God, it was at least a month, maybe even 6 weeks into these negotiations where the FDP said, forget it, we're not going to do this, right? So then there was a period of uncertainty. There was even talk that they might have early elections again. But instead, the union parties and the SPD hammered it out. But it took like 3 or 4 months for the new government to come into power. So, yeah, and this is a problem because there are obviously a lot of important things on the policy agenda right now, not just domestically, but internationally. If there are going to be negotiations over ending Russia's invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, there could be tariffs coming from the United States that would have a dire effect on European, especially German exporters. So anyway, it's unfortunate, but it just takes a while.
And so when we're talking about forming coalitions, and it's probably right going to be the CDU, CSU that's going to form a coalition with somebody. We just don't know exactly who it is right now. But for the lame person that doesn't it hasn't studied German politics and doesn't know a lot about German government, how much influence or power in the government do these smaller parties that the larger party forms a coalition with actually have when it comes to policy decisions and influencing the direction of the country?
Um, Great question. So first, Germany kind of corresponds to other countries in similar situations where the parties usually get a number of ministries, a number of cabinet portfolios, kind of proportional to their share of the coalition's kind of seats, right? So it's not like the SPD comes in with 30% of the coalition's kind of overall share and they get 50% of the portfolios. It's going to be kind of proportional. Sometimes really small parties can punch above their weight and get a little bit more than their strength would justify, but it's not usually that kind of out of kilter. So, in Germany, it matters which party controls which kind of ministry, right? The German system gives a degree of quite a big degree of discretion to the ministers to kind of like run their ministries and to put forth policies that they kind of want to see. So party control over ministries matters an awful lot. It is true that the chancellor can sometimes exert his kind of superordinate power, right? But that's actually much more rare than one might think.
Um, I want to turn a little bit to a different subject because you work at the American German Institute, and there's an interesting thing happening with the AfD and some U.S. I don't know if you want to say politicians or right wing influencers, but they've taken a particular interest in AfD and supporting, you know, their platform. And I'm speaking here particularly about like Elon Musk and JD Vance and others. Do you have any opinions or thoughts about why that might be the case and why there's been such a big push among these people to support AfD?
Oh, well, one can really only speculate. I can't see into Elon Musk or JD Vance's mind or heart, so I don't know for sure why they're doing this. I do think that there is ideological affinity there. Many of the things that the AfD says that they stand for is also are also things that JD Vance, Elon Musk, and other conservatives in the United States care about. So, for instance, the AfD is the only party that actually there's only two parties that have mentioned abortion in their platforms. The CSU, the Bavarians, want to keep things the way they are and not liberalize them a little bit more. The AfD wants a more restrictive abortion stance. They're also pro-natalist. They're trying to find ways to get Germans to have more children and that kind of thing. The AfD is also they love fossil fuels, especially they want to restart gas from Russia. They want to restart nuclear because Germany shut down all of its nuclear power generators. So on the energy angle, there's probably quite a bit that's the same. And the AfD is also pro-Russian. And I mean, it seems to me just from the Munich Security Conference and some other things that we're seeing a very different stance towards Russia under this kind of like Trump administration and what have you. So I think that it really has to probably do with that. If I wanted to be more cynical or Machiavellian, the AfD does want to leave the European Union. That's been part of their, whole, raison d'être from their inception. And we know that Trump doesn't like the European Union. And so therefore, I'm sure JD Vance and Elon Musk, well, especially Elon Musk, don't like it as well. So maybe they're doing what they can to try to see if they can't bring about the weakening, if not the dissolution of the European Union, because then it will be easier to exert leverage over individual countries as opposed to the European Union as a whole, which does have some kind of collective power. So that might be a motivation. It's ironic, though, although maybe it's not ironic. I was going to say that the AfD is also kind of low-key anti-American. Another part of their program is they want to get rid of kind of American missile installations in Germany as well, right? But maybe that's exactly what the Trump administration wants. It gives them justification or a pretext to withdraw troops and war materiel from Germany.
There's two things that you said when you were talking about things that the AfD champions, like the natalist and the pro-Russian. Um, on the natalist point, it's interesting to me that they want people to have more children because their chancellor, correct me if I'm wrong, Alice Weidel is, well, she's in a relationship with another woman. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Does that for a party that's very kind of quote unquote like family values and traditional, how does that play with the party's idea that the head of the party is kind of this international cosmopolitan lesbian woman?
Well, I mean, I think it's also interesting that her wife is actually of Sri Lankan origin, right? And so is a person of color. So that's interesting too, given the AfD's stance on multiculturalism and migration, etc. I mean, she's been asked repeatedly about this, and she either doesn't answer, she deflects, or whatever. She's also said something to the effect of, I'm married to somebody that I've been with for 20 years. So it's not like she's very, um, I don't know, loud and proud about her sexual orientation or gender identity, right? Although, of course, they would never use the word gender identity because they're against what do they call it? They call it the gender craziness, gender Wahn in German kind of thing. So, you know, I guess that her supporters just don't really care that much about that aspect of who she is and her vision, and they like the other stuff.
Okay, okay, understood. And then on the pro-Russian point, I just want to clarify. When you say that they're pro-Russian, do you mean specifically that they've said they, support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or have they just said that they want to stop aid to Ukraine? Have they said that, uh, you know, certain parts of Ukraine belong to Russia? What exactly does that mean when you say they're a pro-Russian
Yeah, I
party?
mean, so I don't think they've been that specific about, what could or should or would happen in that country. But for instance, they want to restart Russian natural gas imports. They want to decrease, if not eliminate, the various sanctions that have been placed on Russia, especially since the invasion in 2022. Um, they, yeah, that would be the main part of how they're kind of pro-Russian.
Um,
Oh, and the other thing too
I
is
know.
they want to stop welfare payments for Ukrainian asylum seekers. So yeah,
Um, I know the election is not only about AfD, and the most likely case scenario is they're not going to be in the government, but I think it is the most striking part of the election because uh, they are such an extreme party in so many areas, and they and also because of Germany's history and Germany's past. Germany has this legacy of World War II and Nazism and Hitlerism, and it felt like for a long time people were in Germany were afraid of voting for a far right party because of that legacy of Nazism and Hitlerism. And I could be totally wrong about that, but it seems like now something has changed. Like maybe that collective memory of you know the shame or the collective shame or whatever from those that era has waned or faded or just been forgotten. I mean, what do you think explains why, from that perspective, why people are willing to vote for a party that actually has that some members have real ties to neo Nazis?
I think that you've hit the nail on the head. That maybe there's a weakening of German memory culture. Some people have also pointed out that uh, I call it Holocaust-centered memory. Holocaust-centered memory was always weaker in Eastern compared to Western Germany because it just wasn't that much of a focus of the communist regime until the very end of the existence of East Germany kind of thing. So Western Germans have many more years, if not decades, of socialization into that kind of memory culture. So that might be one explanation, as some people have argued, in terms of the difference between support for the party in East and West. I mean, it's also been over 80 years since the crimes of the Nazis. And, I mean, my father was German, right? He was born well, he passed away already, but he was born in 1949. So we're talking about like my grandmother, who's been dead since 1997. I mean, her generation. So for my kids, that's their great grandparents. I mean, the personal connection in that regard is increasingly remote, which might inevitably lead to the weakening of the power of this kind of memory. But it's also interesting that when Olaf Scholz and others were pushing back on J.D. Vance's controversial, to say the least, speech at the Munich Security Conference, I guess last week, um, he explicitly brought up, the crimes of the Holocaust and things like that. So certainly, at the level of the establishment, this is something that matters quite a bit to understand German politics. The question is whether and to what extent it still matters for German voters.
I maybe should have led with this, but I'm going to close with this question. Is there anything that you've noticed while actually on the ground in Berlin that you think uh, people who are looking from afar about the situation in Germany have missed, or anything that like surprised you actually being in Germany versus studying it from afar?
Um, I've come to Germany pretty frequently for many years now. So I don't know, somebody who hasn't been here for years might have a different kind of impression than somebody like me. It's kind of like when you watch your kids grow up and they get, taller, 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 taller. And then, a relative comes, hasn't seen them for years, like, oh my gosh, you're 6 inches taller than before. So I don't know, maybe somebody else would have a slightly different reaction to me. But I mean, honestly, like the contradictions we were talking about before in German public opinion, I also see. I mean, this still seems and appears to be a very prosperous place, right? Um, Maybe there's a little bit more visible poverty than one saw 25, 30 years ago. I saw a couple of homeless people in subway stations, and one didn't see that much of that before. But it still seems like a very kind of prosperous place. The other thing that I would mention too is that demographically, Germany really has changed, especially since I started to come here. Well, I came on family trips in the 80s, but as a student and researcher from the 1990s onwards, the reality is that Germany is much more multicultural than it was 30 years ago. And you can see that in the official figures, where more than a quarter of the German population has quote unquote migration background. And given that most of the migrants come to bigger cities, and especially the Western bigger cities, it's very multicultural. Berlin is very multicultural. I mean, I hear every language you can imagine being spoken on the streets, a lot of Slavic languages. I can't tell if it's Russian or Ukrainian or Polish for that matter. You hear a lot of Turkish being spoken. There's a very strong, very large kind of Turkish German community, especially in Berlin and other large cities. I hear Arabic being spoken. So maybe that's the most important thing, that this is a country that has changed demographically. And, there are about a quarter or a fifth of German voters that are uncomfortable with those changes. And that brings us right back to the AfD.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, I mean, do you think that because of both the increasing migration and the population demographics, coupled with a low birth rate in Germany and an aging German population, do you think there is fears that eventually, Germany's not going to be a country for majority Germans?
Um, well, I mean,
I mean, maybe irrationally, but is that something that people are like actually concerned about?
yes, there are quite a few supporters of the AfD and probably other parties too that are kind of worried about that. I mean, that's not going to happen, for a while, given, current demographic trends. But sure, I guess for some people, that's kind of a fear. I personally think, and, I mean, other countries are like this as well, right? That, changes come relatively quickly. And I think it takes some people a while to make their peace with these changes.
Well, that's I think that's all the questions I have. Uh, Dr. Langenbacher, I really appreciate you coming on and speaking about all of these issues and clarifying so much of the important issues surrounding the election with me. I really
Well,
appreciate
thanks
it.
for the invitation. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, and if you want to buy Dr. Langenbacher's textbook later in the year, Where can they do so if they
Well,
want?
it's actually available now. It just came out.
Ah, it's
Yeah, it just
available
came out a
now.
couple of
Okay,
weeks ago. It's
congratulations.
published with Sage CQ Press. So you can go to their website to look for that, but it's also available on Amazon and other venues as well.
Perfect. I'll put a link in the
Thanks.
description for you for that. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated this conversation, and we'll see what happens on
Yeah.
Sunday. Hopefully, no big surprises.
Well, Germans aren't renowned for big surprises, so I'm pretty confident with how it's going to end up.